So the pro-Brexit press and even pro-Brexit news sites were literally lathering themselves up into an almost rabid feud frenzy when recent figures came out recently to suggest that UK exports were surging post-Brexit. But of course, the truth couldn't be further from it. And we'll get into the figures in a bit why. But of course, one of the big things about Brexit was, oh my god, trade, Brexit's all about trade, stupid. And of course, Brexit was always about trade until you would point out that, look, leaving one of the biggest, most successful trading blocs on the planet that literally in trade gravity terms, which is again an observable thing of countries always trade with their closest with their closest neighbours, not, countries halfway round the planet. That is an observable thing, and that's not going to change. And as we have seen again, we are importing more from Europe more than we ever have done before. Mostly because, again, of Brexit. Like I say, these figures, again, someone shared this to me just a couple of days ago about, oh my god, trade is up. Well, again, not when you look really at the figures. And of course, that is what we are going to look at today because, as always, pardon me, trade is a big thing about Brexit until, again, it's not. So, before we do jump into today's article, please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are things like my Patreon page and buy one of today's link called Buy Me Coffee Week. Well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much for those people who do support the channel that way. So on with this article. This comes from the Yorkshire Bylines. The title is Trade After Brexit. Surging ahead or just a false dawn? Official trade figures released this week caused quite a stir on various pro-Brexit news outlets and websites, since they apparently appear to show the UK exports to the EU in the second quarter of the year surging ahead after Brexit. The truth is not as quite as the headlines might have you believe. So a tweet from Foxhole News, a 5,000 strong Twitter followers, greeted the, quote, stunning new figures with glee and final proof that Project Fear had been busted. Pro-EU supporters had been, quote, left red-faced apparently. The Foxhole reporter calls these figures stunning and says that exports shot up by 29% year on year in June as the UK continued to pull out of the pandemic with a world-class jabbing programme and a staged reopening of society and the economy. The report described the UK exports as surging, despite the most dire predictions from rabid pro-EU campaigners. However, Facts for EU, another pro-Brexit website, also hailed the ONS data as a vindication of the 5 years of upheaval, saying that their analysis was showing that UK exports to the EU have, quote, rebounded by over 31% since the first quarter of the year and 20% higher than they were 5 years ago, just before the EU referendum. All the figures originally come from the ONS release on the Thursday of the UK trade data up to the end of June, although Foxhole relies on a report on Bloomberg for their very sensational claims. The figures on the surface do seem to paint a bright picture, although I confess looking through the ONS details, but I cannot find either the 29% that Bloomberg uses or the 31% that Facts for EU suggest, but they are not far out. The general picture of the economy coming out of lockdown hibernation after the enormously body blow delivered by Brexit. But what is the reality? The ONS urges caution, however, and says that the 2020 data was very strongly affected by the coronavirus pandemic. It was also helpfully provides a comparison with the 2018, when trade was not implicated either by COVID or the end of the transition period. Because 2020 was so unusual, a massive rebound was inevitable from such a low base. This is what the ONS says about it. Exports and imports of goods increased during the second quarter of 2021, when compared with the same period in 2020, but fell by total exports of 4.4%, when compared with the same period in 2018. So, not all that rosy. I also strongly suspect that the facts for EU figures showing a 20% increase in exports to the EU uses figures from the second quarter of 2016, underhandedly used for inflation or just to make them appear exceptionally good. What these reports actually show is the sheer deprivation on behalf of Brexiteers to try and grab anything that looks remotely like good news. Unfortunately, the ONS figures are not the lifeline that they think, for several reasons. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, our economy and trade were never going to collapse to zero. These things are relative but not absolute, and whether the figures show that they will be worse than they would be otherwise have been what we have remained since EU members. And Brexiteers are still clinging to the idea that eradicating trade barriers with your largest trade partner will have no effect and lead to an increase in trade. This is impossible, and they must know it. The ONS says that our exports to the EU overtook non-EU countries in May of 2021 and remained higher in June. These figures indicate that while trade with the EU has had a strong recovery, driven by a 0.9% billion increase in exports of chemicals, medical, pharmaceutical products, and exports to the rest of the world have, however, slumped. The ONS says that the total exports of goods fell in June of 2021 were driven by falling exports to non-EU countries. There was a weak increase in exports to EU countries, perhaps not quite the surge that has been claimed though. Exports to the rest of the world of chemicals, cars, machinery, transport equipment, medical and pharmaceutical products all, however, did fall in June. But we were told by the Vote Leave that not one of the main reasons for Brexit was shrinking the importance of the EU market for UK exporters, which meant that we needed to trade faster with growing non-EU economies in the East. To be consistent, now that the exports to the EU are rising faster than non-EU exports, the same people should be pressing for the UK to rejoin, but instead, this is apparently a cause for celebration. At least our exports to the EU seem to be holding up, but in the way that is familiar to anyone who has watched UK trade over the years, imports are increasing faster, says the ONS. Imports of goods from other EU countries drove the increase of the total imports of goods for June of 2021. This has the result in, of course, widening the trade deficit, the difference between what we sell abroad and what we buy, to, of course, 5.2 billion in quarter 2 of 2021. None of this was obviously apparent from the reading of the Foxhole News or the Facts 24 EU article either. And of course, RTE in Ireland is also reporting that imports to the EU from the UK have fallen by 20% in the first 6 months in June, and in May were far lower than the volumes recorded at the end of last year, according to Eurostat data. This is precisely the opposite of the ONS data released on Thursday, as RTE acknowledged. The discrepancy is apparently partly explained by a change in the way Eurostat calculates trade with Britain after Brexit. When we were EU members, all goods which arrived in other member states from Britain were treated as British exports, and since January, goods originating outside the UK, goods made in China are and transshipped through Britain into the Netherlands, for example, are now treated as exports from China than from Britain. Nothing can actually be read into the real ONS figures, covering for such a short period, during of what the ONS itself actually describes as high levels of volatility, especially in trade. However, the British Chamber of Commerce issued a very lengthy statement which gives a far more balanced view. William Barn, the head of trade policy, said this: "There has been a slight decrease in overall exports by about 0.6 billion, which has been matched by a slight increase in exports by 1 billion. The export data has been driven by an increased sales to the EU by 1.2% as demand picked up following the release of lockdowns and the unburdening of pre-EU Brexit stockpiles. As firms begin to try and reorder, by contrast, non-EU exports fell by 5.6% between May and June of this year." Brain adds that in the rise of the EU exports was largely down to more cars coming into the UK. By contrast, car exports to non-EU countries saw falls over the last few months, particularly explained by the staff and the seismic conductor shortages, he said. Compared with the second quarter of 2018, the last stable period before the EU exit, total exports, including the EU, were down by 4.4%, and imports by 2%, compared with June 2021 and to June 2018. The total UK exports, including to the EU, were down by 7.4% and imports by 2%. This is a further signal of the damaging effect of the EU-UK trade caused by the move to the new trading agreements under the TCA, and we will continue to monitor this over the coming months as more further data emerges. So as you can see, not really that good when you actually dig into the data. And of course, Brexiteers everywhere were salivating as this was somehow some sort of good news. But like I say, as was said there, if we are relying on these exports to the EU, then the case to rejoin is automatically made for us. They should be very clearly, again, following their own arguments by saying, oh, Britain needs to cut itself off from the EU and trade with more these emerging European, these non-EU, especially Far East markets. If that was true for the case for Brexit, then the case for trade that we are seeing now justifies them calling for the exact rejoining of the EU to something which they claimed to leave for so long. And of course, as of always, trade is constantly in flux. It is constantly trading. So again, being outside of the single market doesn't appear to be doing us any good. So as always, thanks for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe on the way out. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.